Okay, we continue our series about instructive endgames. This time we're going to look at another rook endgame. Let's see its some features. The black king is cut off, but only one file. And the rook is in front of the pawn. Okay, let's see how white plays and wins. King b4. If rook d4, then there's an important technique, rook d8. To get the king in front of the pawn, so you have to take, and after king b4 you play king c8 exclamation mark, and it's a draw, because you can take the opposition, for example, king c5. And it's stalemate. So after king b4, only move to try to win, because if you now play rook d8, you can take, king b5, king c7, king c pawn, king c5, and wins, for example. And the pawn promotes, because you control these important squares in front of the pawn. Okay, king b4, rook b8 check. Now you play king a5, rook c8. Because if the rook defends, then you can play king d7, and it's a draw again. So king b5, rook b8 check, king a6, the king's coming, rook c8, and now rook d4. This is the important position. This is the lesson from this game. You defend the pawn from the side, and you keep the king out of getting in front of the pawn. King e6, king b7 attacks him. And now if king e5, then simply rook d5 check and wins. And if you play rook c5, king b6, rook c8, c5, and white wins, for example. Let's see, rook goes, advances, rook goes, king b7 check, c8, black waits, black waits, back for king e7, c7, waiting move, check, has to go, king d7, check, king c6, check, king e6, check, and rook c4, and you have built the bridge, like we already shown in a previous video. So what are the lessons? If the king is cut off, the king and the pawn can advance, normally. Second, a defensive method for the weaker pawn in rook and pawn endings is try to get a pawn ending that's drawn, like rook d4, rook d8, so to get the king passing over to the c pawn. And white has to use the king in a creative way. Now this is the other crucial point, you defend and keeps the king cut off. King e6 attacks. Now the best is of course a rook c5, and then king b6, and you advance, for example. And it's the Lucena position. Okay, any comments please on YouTube. Thank you very much.